Josh Rogin. I'm a columnist at the Washington Post. This is my fifth Sedona Forum. I'm so glad to be back at this very pivotal time in U.S. and international affairs. I think the fact that we're all still here after so many years past Senator McCain's passing shows that not only does his legacy survive, but also the people willing to do the work to fulfill his mission. And I think a lot of that owes to the credit of the McCain Institute staff. We should give them a big round of applause for setting up an amazing forum. Bringing us all here. They got Secretary Yellen to fly in, and then they got Secretary Blinken to fly in right after, which is a feat previously only accomplished by Xi Jinping. I do have to, just as a matter of journalistic integrity, before we start, point out that Secretary Blinken actually misquoted Senator McCain last night when he attributed to him the quote of, "It's always darkest before it goes completely black." I know the McCainiacs in the room remember this, but when Senator McCain would say that, he would attribute it to Mao Zedong. And he would say, as Mao said, "It's always darkest before it goes completely black." And the reason that's funny is because Mao never said that. And McCain knew that Mao never said that. And that's what was funny to Senator McCain, not quoting Mao Zedong, but misquoting Mao Zedong. So before any other panelists mangle John McCain's jokes further, I'm going to repeat some of them that you might remember from the old days. And if you've heard me say these before, that's the point. They're always the same. So, and this is also to preempt Senator Whitehouse's speech tonight so that he has to make his staff rewrite his speech tonight. So there was the famous one after my 2008 election. I slept like a baby, sleep for 2 hours, wake up and cry, sleep for 2 hours, wake up and cry. There was the one, 2 inmates on the chow line at the Illinois State Prison. This is Randy's favorite. 2 inmates on the chow line, the Illinois State Prison. One turns to the other and says, "You know, the food was a lot better here when you were governor." And then this is Senator Whitehouse's favorite that I'm going to steal. "What's the difference between a catfish and a lawyer? One's a scum-sucking bottom dweller, and the other one's a fish."
I'm pretty sure you did say those last year, Josh.
I did. They were always the same. That was funny. There weren't that many of them, but Senator McCain repeated them, so I think we can repeat them. Despite that, his comedic shortcomings, I think it was really nice to see Senator Romney and Secretary Blinken prove that a serious adult conversation about foreign policy in a bipartisan way is still possible, at least for the next 7 months or so. But then all bets are off, perhaps. And that's what we're here to discuss today. And I couldn't be more pleased to have this expert panel. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. Representative Jason Crow, Democrat from Colorado, a former Army Ranger who served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, was awarded the Bronze Star. He's also an attorney. Nobody's perfect. He now serves on the House Intelligence Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he's the ranking Democrat on the Oversight and Accountability Subcommittee. Alexandra Hall Hall, whose distinguished career in what was then Her Majesty's Diplomatic Service, now His Majesty's Diplomatic Service, included tours in Bogota, an ambassadorship in Georgia, which we'll talk about, and many other places. She also served as the Brexit counselor at the British Embassy in Washington, a position for which she stepped down and publicly declared that she could no longer peddle half-truths for leaders she did not trust, which was a pretty brave thing to do at that time. So I'm sure we'll get no half-truths from her today. And Ambassador Martin Kimani, who is serving right now as Kenya's permanent representative to the United Nations for the next 10 days or so. So he's almost at the point where he can tell us anything that's on his mind. And we're looking forward to that. He was also a top counterterrorism expert and an international envoy for counterterrorism. We're very pleased to have him here today. And I think I just want to start where our lunch discussion stopped. And this wasn't how I was planning this, but I think it makes a lot of sense to sort of engage the premise that Governor Sununu put to all of us, which is a premise that you hear a lot in Washington, which I think needs to be engaged honestly, that despite Trump's faults, that he's the lesser of 2 evils, and that rather than criticize Trump, we should examine why in 2024 America he's quote unquote winning, if we're willing to at least concede that for the sake of this discussion according to the polls. And that sort of, let me start with you, Representative Crow. First of all, how would you respond to that? And second of all, do you think he's going to win?
Well, thanks, Josh, and thanks to the McCain Institute for having us here. And I actually thought this was supposed to be a survivalist tutorial on building bunkers in the mountains of Colorado, but we won't have to do that. I don't think he's going to win. He could. There's no doubt about that. It's closer than I would like it to be. And I think the humbling part about that is there is a isolationist, nationalist movement, not just within America, but around the world, that we are all combating. And it is a narrative that is a compelling narrative for folks, right? Given the challenges that people are facing, given the digital advancements that we've seen, that we talked about here earlier, given the economic pressures, given the fact that the American dream, as it's been framed for multiple generations, is out of reach for a lot of young folks in America now. Upward mobility is out of reach for a lot of folks, not just in the United States, but around the world. And that's creating this confluence of factors that make this narrative compelling. So we're certainly not at the point where we can take for granted this notion that if we just tell people that democracy is a fundamental good, that American engagement, American leadership is a fundamental good, that they'll just accept that as true. Right? We actually have to show that, we have to deliver, and we have to repeatedly have counter-programming to that narrative. And if we don't, then yes, we could lose. But I think we can win, and groups like this show that.
Well, let me ask you, before I move on, a quick follow-up question, and I'll ask a version of this question to each of our panelists. From your perspective, as a member of Congress, what can Congress do? What should Congress do, both before the election and then perhaps after the election if Trump wins, to continue the integrity of our institutions that may be under attack, to provide guardrails against what Trump and his second-term administration might try to do to undermine those institutions, and to promote or even sustain the internationalist foreign policy that most of us in this room would support?
Well, the first is we are messengers. There's 535 of us that represent the entire country. We go back to our districts every weekend, and we're doing town halls. Like, if you want to amplify a message, it's members of Congress that can do that, right? Because the challenge that we face is we're combating the influence of cable news networks. We're combating the influence of social media networks, and it's very hard to reach folks and combat those narratives, but we can still do it. Right? When we spread out around the country in any given weekend, there are literally thousands of town halls and public events that members of Congress are doing. That is a powerful tool if we do it effectively. So making sure that we have that counter-programming is really important. The second is by actually governing and delivering, because the narrative that there is dysfunction, that the system does not work, is a growing one, because we see in many cases there is truth to that. So our ability to deliver a national security supplemental, to get the budget done, is really important. And then the third is we actually have a global diplomacy role. And we saw that under the Trump administration, when there would be occasions where we would go on congressional delegations, and I would do a lot of travel as a member of the Intel Committee and Foreign Affairs and Armed Services Committee, a lot of travel, and people were extremely eager for members of Congress to come and visit their countries, because they wanted to know, what are the American people actually thinking? Because they would get a stream of visits from diplomats and folks within the administration that would be telling one story. Then we would be able to have actually a parallel diplomatic message that would be able to say, you know what, the American people are actually committed to this. And we're struggling with the administration, we're combating the administration, but we were able to break through and keep those relationships alive during that period in a way that if we hadn't been engaged, we would have lost a lot of them, I think.
Interesting. Well, that's a perfect segue to my question for you, Alex, because you were in one of those allied governments at the time of the first Trump administration. So my main question to you is the same: is what are the things that should be done before the election to perhaps insulate and build resilience inside of our democratic institutions, just in case they come under attack again? And then what do you see as the responsibility of U.S. allies, both before and after the election, to mitigate against what might be some of the more isolationist and populist instincts of a future Trump administration.
Okay, thank you, Josh, and thank you to the McCain Institute for inviting me. I feel a little bit intimidated, given the quality of other speakers, and given that we're talking about American politics. Before you all think, who is this snotty Brit daring to comment on British politics, I'm proud to share with you I am an American citizen and I'm a voter. I'm very honoured to be an American citizen and I intend to vote and use it. Thank you, America. Go, America. I believe in you. I think it was Damon last year who said, we need to send you around America to show that people still believe in you.
The zealous of a convert.
Yeah, and absolutely, of a non-smoker. So, I can't believe this. I knew my kid would ring about baseball at some stage. Stop it, go away. It may come on again in 10 minutes. I just want to pick up something from the earlier session before I say my answer to how to survive America first is dolphins, and I'll explain that. Character matters in leadership, and I worked for Boris Johnson until I realized I couldn't, because his character fundamentally was unsuited to leadership. And I saw what flawed character-driven leadership results in, which is in national decline, economic and political. And so you cannot divorce your own state's situation from your nation's situation and your nation's standing in the world. And it is absolutely essential that we don't just consider how do we survive America first. My first recommendation is there anything we can do between now and November to stop America first? Do we have to take it as read that we are drifting like the container ship towards the Francis Scott Key Bridge with no power to stop it? We all saw that video. The power went out and the ship plowed into the bastion. That is what Donald Trump is representing. He is a container ship, rather large, overloaded, headed straight towards the foundations, not just of American democracy, but of our global security. We should be thinking about how to stop him even getting there, rather than how we can survive it afterwards. And I would really love in the session with Rick and David Axelrod this evening to tease out, is there anything the parties can do? Because, as was pointed out in the previous session, the vast majority of voters are not happy with their current choices. Are we just doomed to drift powerless towards a contest between two people who we don't think necessarily are the right people for that role? So character matters. I think we're drifting towards disaster and we should be trying to stop it. I'm going to extend the analogy of the container ship and the bridge. If we can't stop it, then at least we can do what the navigator of that ship did, which is warn people of the consequences. And it is incumbent on every single influential person in this room and your friends to explain why it matters so much and what is at stake for not just America, but for the world, and why America First is a flawed policy that won't just hurt your allies, but will hurt you as well. So we can't stay silent about this. And one of the things that most disappointed me over the last few years, and this is why I apologize, I am now an American, so I feel I can say this. I've been so disappointed at the political cowardice of so many people in Washington to call it out for what it is. And I've seen it in my own country of origin, the political cowardice of so many politicians knowing that Brexit was going to be harmful to the UK, and who went along with it anyway for their own short-term political gain. And we are suffering from that decision on and on and on. So speak up like the driver of that container ship who did manage to save lives. Third, build redundancy in the system. When we saw the bridge collapse, one of the most graphic things is it wasn't just the immediate girder that collapsed, it was sort of a ripple effect. So many other parts of the bridge collapsed. And what we need to do is figure out how can we contain the damage that can be done if we have an America First ideologically driven presidency, surrounded by individuals determined to make it happen, and without the protective guardrails we had before in the form of Mattis and other creditable secretaries, many of whom have said they wouldn't serve in a second Trump term. So how do we build redundancy so that the contamination doesn't spread? And then I come to this issue of dolphins. Since we all learned about dolphins after the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse, dolphins are the buffers you put around well-constructed bridges to try and head off a catastrophe in the first place. And so that leads on to what should allies do? And this isn't just about Trump. We should be doing it anyway because of Russia and because of China and because of Iran. We all need to be prioritizing our national defense. This is for real now. We are really facing global disorder. Coincidentally, the name of my new podcast. But anyone want to be interviewed on it? This is really serious. And again, in the UK, they're still talking about we'll increase our defense budget to 2.5% when circumstances allow. No, the circumstances need it. This is no longer a luxury when we've managed to pay everything else. We need to prioritize building up our capabilities. Europe needs to get its shit together on defense procurement and capabilities and being able to operate without needing American forces. We need to be putting in more buffers for the Baltic states. I hope to God we support Ukraine moving closer to the EU, and personally, I think we should be letting them into NATO. The time is now. We haven't got the luxury. So
All right.
that's where I am.
Thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about, and I look forward to hearing about the dolphins on your next podcast episode, because I think that could be a whole podcast about the dolphins. Let's hope it turns out better than the Baltimore ship crash. But anyway, Ambassador Martin, I hate to put you in the position of speaking for the entire global South, but here we are. I think it's quite important, actually, to understand how the developing world views U.S. politics in the 2024 election. So before I ask you about the specific circumstances of your own government, I'm wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit more regionally about what how your region views the prospect of another Trump presidency, a little bit about your experience in the first time around, and what does this sort of obvious and clear dysfunction in U.S. politics mean for countries that are making hard choices about which development patrons to work with and how to orient themselves in this multipolar environment.
Thank you, Josh, and good afternoon to you all. I will say first, I will not regurgitate my talking points. I think I owe you a more authentic and direct engagement with you. So my country's position, let me shelve it just slightly and perhaps give you the courtesy of my thoughts. And then also thank the McCain Institute for inviting me. Senator McCain is somebody who I admired from a distance because of his ability to speak truthfully and boldly and to lead with a sense of deeper responsibility, not just to the United States, but to the global community as well. Now, on America First, I'll tell you that during President Trump's term in office, he met the Kenyan president, President Uhuru, twice. Both times in the White House, and the second time was the day that he survived an impeachment vote. And he was extremely generous towards President Kenyatta. He tabled, and his administration tabled, a free trade deal between Kenya and the United States that was going to be really the second free trade agreement the United States has with an African country, the other one being Morocco. And Treasury Secretary Mnuchin was very much leading from the front on that. President Trump also loosened the rules of engagement on fighting al-Shabaab in Somalia. And so in many ways, what followed in terms of American action in Somalia, one can say without being controversial, saved lives in Kenya. So net-net, President Trump was popular to the Kenyan people. But you know who else is really popular? President Biden, because the polls, when Africans by and large are polled about American presidents, they usually are very popular. The person sitting in the White House is popular. And so why are they popular? Why are they popular? And I want to say that before I comment too much on America first, is the reason the person sitting in the White House is popular is because people associate the American presidency with a bold and positive leadership. The American president is the person who leads the creation of institutions such as the United Nations that become crucial to decolonization. Many of the decolonized countries in the 1960s have the United Nations to thank for that. And therefore, you have the United States to thank for that. If you look at the 1956 debacle with the UK in Egypt, when the United States refused European powers to go on their colonial romps, that was a key moment in the decolonization moment. So that's what people associate the United States with. People associate the United States with George Bush's PEPFAR program that saved millions of people. So this popularity is there to waste. And I think there is almost a bipartisan, not agreement, but disregard for the opportunity that is Africa. So whether it's President Trump or others, Africa is far too low on the policy agenda, and meanwhile, other powers and other actors are on the move. So if you look at the green transition, if you look at minerals, if you look at geopolitical votes in the UN, there are other countries that are making their claim. Russia is making its claim. China is making its claim. So the United States, when it comes to Africa, many of the administrations continue to see it as a lower priority, right? So now this administration, and I was really happy to be here yesterday evening to listen to Secretary Blinken, has made a real concerted attempt over the last year and a half or so to really make an argument towards Africa and to make an argument towards broadly the global South. What he said to me that was striking and welcome was, we have a better deal. Now the question is, do you have a better deal? That's what Secretary Blinken said. But is it true? Does the United States have a better deal for the so-called global South? And whoever occupies the White House after January next year, the question about America's standing in the world will be determined not entirely, but significantly, by the kind of deal that they offer countries in the global South. So an isolationist America will offer a less good deal. And that less good deal will mean vacuums being left for other powers to fill and to create a more conflictual world. So a better deal, whatever the label you put on it, if America first leads to a better deal for Africa, then go for America first. If it doesn't, then find another way. My final comment, Josh, is yesterday evening I met some really smart people, and we had a very brief conversation about, across a range of capabilities and assets, the United States continues to be far and away the preeminent power globally. But listening to Americans talk about their country, one is struck by the lack of confidence in that. There's almost a sense of demoralization, a sense of weakness where there's no weakness, and that then leads to a very perverse sort of reaction of being defensive when you don't need to be defensive. I think the United States needs to stick to what it has done in the world, stick to the institutions that it has built, have the confidence that even though it's frustrating negotiating and compromising with all of us foreigners, that ultimately American leadership, when it's confident and self-assertive, is what the world welcomes.
Yeah. Well said.
Well, thank you for that perspective. I think it's really important because it's true, and I can attest to this from my own reporting, that the Trump administration's foreign policy was not universally despised around the world. In fact, in many places, it was praised in certain instances, and in many places it was a mixed bag. And you could tell another story about the Trump administration's policy in Africa that included the drive to kill PEPFAR by some people in the Trump world, or the drive to pull counterterrorism resources out of Africa that they didn't fully achieve, but they tried at the end. So I think it's important to understand that in a second Trump administration, we don't know what the policies, but we don't know who the people would be. I think anyone who writes an article who says we know what the policies are going to be is not really being an honest broker, because the only thing that's assured is unpredictability. And so that sort of brings me to the question about the Middle East, because one of the places where you'll find a lot of Trump supporters is in Israel. I know from my reporting in Japan, that's another place. And let me just ask you, bring back to you, Representative Crow, on the Israel question. And let me read you a quote from President Trump's very recent interview in Time magazine. Quote, I'm not going to do the voice. I did Golan Heights. Nobody even thought of Golan Heights. I gave them Golan Heights. I did the embassy and in Jerusalem. Jerusalem became the capital. I built the embassy. I even built the embassy, and it's a beautiful embassy for a lot less money than anybody ever thought possible. Okay, so if you take away the grammatical awfulness, there's an argument there, which a lot of people in Israel will attest to, the Abraham Accords, et cetera, that Trump foreign policy might actually be in some places more aggressive and more assertive and more supported internationally than the alternative. What do you think about that, Representative Crow? And what do you think, and do you see a scenario where maybe Trump 2.0 has its upsides?
Well, to the ambassador's point about confidence, it's such a key point, and it goes to what you just read. He had confidence. It's a lot of it's not true, and he lies and he misleads and he doesn't tell the full story. But there's a confidence there that people respond to, and there is this and I actually see it exactly what you described, Ambassador. I see this when I'm visiting and traveling and doing my CODELs. We are very good at being self-critical and self-reflective and talking about our own problems. That's actually a strength of ours. But we also view our opponents as 10 feet tall as well, which creates this crisis of confidence. And Trumpism and Donald Trump is good at doing that in very limited circumstances, but it has a shelf life. He certainly picks winners and losers, and he picks sides without a holistic view of policy. I think what you've seen over the last 24 hours is some extremely competent national security professionals in this administration that understand multiple sides of an issue and how to prevent things from flaring up into much larger conflict. And of course, that's the leadership that we need. And the Israel challenge has been the toughest challenge from a political and a policy perspective that I have encountered in my time in Congress. There's no doubt about it, because it requires us to hold multiple truths at the same time. I'm somebody who, way before October 7th, has been a firm supporter of Israel. One of the authors and supporters of the Future of Warfare Act to help develop next generation of weapons in collaboration with Israel, helping deepen the intelligence sharing relationship with Israel. I've done a lot of things. But I've also been a supporter of the two-state solution, because as Secretary Blinken very eloquently said last night, there is no path, in my view, no path to a peace unless both peoples have dignity, the rights to self-determination, and security. So it has to be true that Israel will remain the Jewish homeland and have the right for self-defense. It has to be true that the Palestinians have to have the right for statehood and their own security and self-determination. It is true that Hamas must be dismantled. And it is also true that the manner in which that is done is key. And that's why on Friday I actually led a coalition of 88 of my colleagues in the House of Representatives and sent a letter to President Biden saying that we have deep, deep concerns for the approach that the Netanyahu government is taking that is putting 1.1 million Palestinians at a severe risk of famine, because that does not serve Israel's security and standing in the world. It certainly doesn't serve America's standing in the world. And when we're out talking about Ukraine and talking about rule of law and talking about the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law. What I'm seeing and what I'm getting is a lot of folks that see a split screen between what's happening there and what's happening in other places when we're out talking about that notion.
So I take that point. I guess I'm wondering if I can press you to answer Governor Sununu's challenge directly, and I think it deserves an honest take. And basically what he said is, we have to examine, we can't dismiss 50-something% of Americans who might support Trump. We have to ask ourselves, why is he winning? Now, I'm not conceding that he's winning, but for the purposes of this discussion, we have to ask ourselves why he has so much support. And what do you think? I mean, I talk to Arab American and Muslim American friends who are very willing to vote for Trump. Despite the fact that they know intellectually that probably their interests are better served with a Biden presidency than a Trump presidency. But yet here we are. So how do you answer Governor Sununu's question? Why is it, given all of this evidence that we've seen of the chaos and et cetera, that still so many Americans seem to be willing to go for another round?
Well, I think it goes to what I said earlier, is that I'm a very patriotic person. I do believe that America's leadership in the world matters. I do believe that we're the best and strongest country, albeit our promise of a more perfect union is not yet fulfilled, and we have a lot of issues that we have not yet addressed that we're seeing and we're having to deal with right now. But when you talk to younger folks, and the frame that people under 35, under 40 will often say is that we have come of age over the last 20 years where America has been at war almost my entire life. We have dealt with the existential threat of climate crisis. Higher education is out of reach and very unaffordable. I can no longer afford to buy a home. Home ownership at my age, when my parents and grandparents were buying a home in their 30s, I cannot do that. Now that's unaffordable. Right? That is the construct when I said that for a lot of folks, the American dream as I define it, is that every generation can do better than the last. Right? Every generation we're leaving better off than the last. And a lot of generations do not believe right now that is attainable. So that is the challenge, right? And this nationalism rhetoric, the Trump rhetoric, really goes to the heart of that. Now, his solutions are wrong, right? His solutions are divisive. They will destroy us. They will tear us down. And his policies do not actually address those issues. But it is compelling, and it does go to the heart of those frustrations. So we can't ignore it, right? Ignoring it would be at our great peril. To write off or to whitewash the very real frustrations of these folks. The more we ignore it, I think the worse it gets. So understanding that we have great strengths, we have great opportunity, we can do great things, but we have very real challenges for vast swaths of our country. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I spent about a decade of my life in a very small Rust Belt town of about 15,000. This was a town that used to be an industrial town, where they, for decades, built ovens, ranges. That factory went out of business a long time ago, and as I biked around growing up around there, the stores shuttered, the downtown was gutted. These are the types of towns that have been decimated by fentanyl. We cannot ignore the realities of vast swaths of rural America, of industrial America. We have great policies, but we have to get out there and we have to address them.
Thank you very much. I totally agree that there's a legitimate grievance at the heart of what Trump is trying to sell, but also on the international front. And I'm going to turn to you, Alex, for this question. By the way, we will have a short time for questions, so if you want to ask a question, start thinking about it now. We'll get to that very shortly. Ukraine is a perfect example. You could blame Tucker Carlson, or as Mitch McConnell does, or you could just admit that there is a lot of fatigue on the left and the right with internationalism, much less interventionism. And there's some justification for that fatigue, frankly. But when it comes to Ukraine, this is a particularly sore subject because we spent 6 months letting Ukraine bleed ammunition, and eventually Trump came around and half endorsed it, and then it passed in a week. And so we already see the chaos and the prospects of a future Trump administration affecting the battle in Ukraine. But let me just read you another quote from his recent Time interview to set up this question. Quote, this is Donald Trump, "I want Europe to pay. I want nothing bad to happen to Europe. I love Europe. I love the people of Europe. I have a great relationship with Europe, but they're taking advantage of us, both on NATO and on Ukraine." So Alex, make that make sense and give us the European perspective, especially with regard to Ukraine, on the prospects of Trump 2.0.
Okay, so I remember shortly after September 11th, 2001, Tony Blair came to address a joint session of the Houses of Congress, and I was very lucky to have a chance to attend that. And he made this wonderful speech, and it's been seared in my memory ever since then. And he said, you know, "I know you're tired of the job of being the world's policeman, but the job is yours to do." And it's the burden of great nationdom. And as speaker after speaker has said, we need America. And when America is not leading the world, it falls into chaos. There is no one who can step up and fill America's shoes. However, we can't expect America to do it by itself. And for far too long, Europe has free-ridden on the American security guarantee. And we've been building up our lovely Social Security and our 35-hour working weeks and indulging in some quite nice policies that have suited us domestically. But it is true, America has carried a larger burden on the defense side. But I think the message is beginning to get through to Europe, and it isn't so much because of Trump, it's because of Russia. Russia, in that sense, did send a warning signal across Europe. It's remarkable how quickly the UK and the EU actually managed to start cooperating again on Ukraine. It's remarkable how it's bolstered NATO, and it's made very real these subjects that we're discussing. And Iran's attack on Israel reminded us all again of the greater threat that Israel faces. It sort of changed that narrative. So irrespective of Trump, it is way past time for Europe to understand we can't just allow America to bear the burden. We have to step up. And that's what I was alluding to in my earlier remarks. Trump in his Time interview suggested we now need to be getting to 3% defense budgets. And even if it's not about him withdrawing the US from NATO. Thankfully, the Congress has put a dolphin in place by passing legislation saying the US can't, the president can't just withdraw the US from NATO. It has to be an act of Congress. That is the kind of dolphin that we all need to be putting in place to try and limit and constrain some of the worst decisions that can be taken. But we all know the real danger is the worry, what if the US doesn't come to the aid of Estonia or Poland? So the answer is we have to. I mean, if Ukraine can do it,
well, you're an American, so it's they have to.
Well, I get confused sometimes.
You can have it both ways, that's fine.
By the way, I actually have a really good story here. Please, journalists in the room, don't shot me on this. It's absolutely protocol. You're never supposed to say what the Queen has told you, but she's dead. And I had an audience with her before I became ambassador to Georgia. And she said, Georgia, yes, they've been having a little trouble with Russia, haven't they? And I said, yes, Your Majesty. And she said, Putin, once a KGB man, always a KGB man.
Wow.
Don't quote me. I've breached all diplomatic protocol. She understood it.
That was on the record, so.
Oh, God, it's filmed.
Cat's out of the bag. I don't think
It's
she'll
filmed.
be complaining.
It's
I think
filmed. Never mind. She's dead. God bless her. But, we can see this threat. It is incumbent on us. If the Ukrainians can hold Russia back the way that they can, surely we can. We can't just assume we have to have America. We need to be investing in our own defense.
Gotcha.
And I also believe that Trump is, like other authoritarian leaders, we should take him at face value. When he says what he's going to do, I think we should take it quite seriously. This stuff about Schedule F, removing all these civil servants, I think we should take it seriously. So the 3%, I think we should take seriously. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. On that cheery note, Ambassador, let me go to you. You actually gave a speech at the UN recently on Ukraine, which I thought was very interesting. Give us quickly the highlights of that speech, but also address this larger question of, maybe there might be an upside to Trump 2.0, and on the other hand, maybe the challenge of revitalizing American leadership is not actually a partisan one. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, all roads of trouble usually lead to map making in London.
Yeah.
Don't look at her.
I'm
She's
an American. I'm an American.
The Queen's dead.
Are there any Brits in the room?
Yeah, if you trace root causes, there's somebody in the Foreign Commonwealth Office drawing a map.
I'm not a diplomat either.
So look, let me just take it back, and I'm not going to give a history lesson, but very, very quickly. The 1950s come, the decolonization period gets on. You start getting independence. A country like mine gets independence 1963. Within a week, we become members of the UN. Why? Because we see in the charter safety from any continued imperial ambitions on ourselves. And at that point, you can't be confident, right? You can't be confident that the European powers that have conquered you and colonized you will not want another bite. So you go into the UN to be safe. Then you create institutions founded on the UN Charter. So the Organization of African Unity is founded on the UN Charter. And it says, look, we are going to keep these absurd borders. They're completely absurd. Well, I think all borders are either absurd or bloody, right? So it's better absurd than bloody. So we then maintain for the last 60 years, essentially with a slip up here and there, the same absurd borders. And we say we're going to integrate ourselves legally and peacefully because they're absurd. But rather than invade each other and try and redraw them up on the basis of power, we decide to go on the basis of law. This is a great American achievement in backing that charter, backing those institutions that you are so impatient with today. So then you dial forward to the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, which is the opposite action. It is not saying, let us integrate peacefully and legally through persuasion. It is saying, I will use force. I will shatter the rules that we've set up for ourselves. And so those are two different worlds that are there. And so going forward, whoever is in the White House, there's going to be a path to a multipolar order that is lawful and that is peaceful. And there's another path to a multipolar order of impunity and the assertion of power against those who are weak enough to be vulnerable to it. Yeah? And sitting in between those two paths, or rather deciding those two paths, there's been so much conversation here about deterrence, about American strength, about the quality of weapons, about how much money to give to Ukraine. That is all well and good, and I do not want to second guess that. There are a lot of experts, there are a lot of people here who understand that very well. But the other part of it is going to be that string of institutions that was created after World War II, where the great power of the day said, rather than try and win the whole prize for myself, I am going to bind myself to certain rules and institutions, right? So I think part of the assignment and part of the bandwidth required is to revitalize those institutions, not to merely trash them. And I find a lot of Americans, of whatever political persuasion, are so impatient with the talk shop in New York and the banks in Washington and all the rest of that structure that you actually set it all up for a person in the White House who wants to walk away from it all. And if they do, those rules, those annoying rules that constrain great power will not be available to do even the minimal constraining that they're doing now. So it's extremely important to have the bandwidth. And finally, humiliation is not good foreign policy. If you humiliate people, they'll come back at you in one way or another. And I think, I won't even get into the issues of Gaza, Israel, Palestine, etc. What is going to be so necessary post-January, whether it is Congress doing it or the occupant of the White House, is going to understand that great power and the better deal is not through humiliating or attempting to use force to find your way. Because when you do, you find there's no single nation. And America is very powerful, but not powerful enough to dominate the world through a standard of humiliation and assertion and domination. You're going to have to convince us. You're going to have to show us this is our essential deal for you. And it's all there to play for, right? So I think America first, whether it's the America first of President Trump, or it's the foreign policy for the American middle class, which is President Biden's foreign policy sort of framing, whatever it is, it needs the bandwidth, one, to re-energize and reinvent the institutions that America led in building, and two, to look at countries like Kenya and see us as an opportunity for you, not an impediment. And open your mind not just to the transatlantic relationship with the Europeans, but also the American-Africa relationship. Too much of America's relationship with Africa has run through Europeans. We don't want that. We do not want America to deal with us through Paris and London. We want it to be direct.
Yeah,
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, that deserves a round of applause.
Well said.
I couldn't think of a better note to end on. Unfortunately, we are out of time. If you do have questions, please accost the panelists outside as they're trying to get their drinks. And what I've taken from this conversation is that the need for all of us to support these values and these institutions is not going away, no matter who wins the presidency. And I'm encouraged by the ideas and by the resilience of our panelists and by everybody in this audience. And I look forward to working with you to keep these values alive in America and around the world. And could you please give our panelists another round of applause? And thank you so much.